All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Pursuit of Property podcast. I'm here with my fellow co-host, Scott Farrow, and we've done one book episode so far. It was when we talked about partnerships, and we talked about our lessons learned from rocket fuel. We got a lot of great feedback on that episode, so Scott and I wanted to do another kind of book review, summary, outline, lessons learned kind of thing for another book. One that I think is one of the most important books we've ever read, applicable to real estate, life, whatever business you're in, which is Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. And the book's right here in the description. We're going to be putting in the Amazon link and everything like that. But we just kind of wanted to sit down and talk about the book. So let's kind of just jump into it.
When we talk about books that we recommend all the time, this is one of the top ones. We refer to Never Split the Difference as one of our best negotiation guides. The real thing here is that Chris Voss was actually a hostage negotiator for the FBI. And so a lot of what he was negotiating was more life and death. So some of the examples can be very extreme and entertaining to listen to. In practice, this stuff can all be used at your home life, in your work life, everywhere. So we found it really helpful. We've personally seen our own negotiation confidence go up. And also, I feel like we've seen monetary success. Our close ratios went up, everything like that after reading the book and reviewing.
That's what I was going to say, because I think you and Jason read it around the same time, and you tell everybody when you recommend the book, what happened?
Well, so I'm not going to speak for Jason, but I'm 90% sure that this happened too. But Jason and I both read it around the same time. And after I read this book, all of a sudden, I started closing deals so much more often. Frequency went up. Now, there's a lot of things that add to that, right? Follow-up plays a really big part. Interperson communication, experience. But I think for me, I started getting better deals at deeper discounts because of my understanding of this book and constant review. And we talk about it in our episode about your first appointment.
Yeah.
I still, every time I go to an appointment, try to listen to one of these chapters on audio when I'm driving to the appointment, just as a good refresher, just because a lot of these things are really uncomfortable when you first start, but they're natural psyche moves. And so knowing how to use them correctly, getting your timing right, practicing in the car, these are all things that really help, and they've helped me. So we wanted to talk about it today when it comes to the art of persuasion and negotiation.
Perfect. So let's talk about how you talk to people, whether you're negotiating, everyday life. Obviously, in sales, you want to, there's a way to do it with your mannerisms, your posture, your tone of voice, XYZ. So let's talk about that first. In the book, it kind of talks about three main voices and tone of voice, specifically depending on what kind of situation you're in. Right. And I know the default voice, which I find ourselves doing when we're following up with leads or following up with people on our SOI, or
we typically talk like it too when we're talking to anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is just kind of the they call it the playful, positive voice, right? Your kind of default voice. You come across very friendly and calm, not too overbearing, not too serious. And that should be the default voice.
Yeah, your pace is usually fairly fast, and your tonal inflections are usually a little bit more inflected and things like that. It's a subconscious thing, but in sales, people always refer to it as the salesperson voice.
Yeah,
and it is. It's a little bit played up, but they talk in the book about making sure you try to make sure you keep a rein on how much you play that up. People get uncomfortable sometimes when you overemphasize things.
100%. And we'll jump into this section a little bit later in the podcast, talking about kind of matching the tonality and the personality of the other person you're talking to. But there's another voice, and the book refers to it as the late night FM DJ voice.
That's kind of the voice that we use on the podcast.
Yeah. So it's a little more calm. It's slower. Your goal is to create a feeling of trust with the other person you're talking to.
Yeah.
So you're slowing down. You're talking more, kind of like this, exactly like you were talking about in the podcast voice.
Right. The idea with the FM DJ voice is that by slowing things down, people are very uncomfortable in negotiation. And so this is a way of continuing to help calm them They feel more at ease. When you're talking in a playful voice, you can sound anxious or you can cause anxiety. And really what comes here is this is the voice that you use to continue to develop authority and rapport. So these are the really, the playful voice. This is what you're going to be talking about most of the time. And this is how you're really going to communicate with people when you're not in the middle of a negotiation.
Yeah.
And then when you get into the negotiation, you can kind of slide down a little bit in your octave. And then you start talking in that FM DJ radio voice.
The example I can think of, at least in our industry, is, for example, let's say going on an appointment, right? And you're meeting the seller possibly in person for the first time in most cases. Mm-hmm. And, they walk up, you're meeting them. Hey, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, how are you? It's great to meet you in person. Catch me up to speed on the property. So XYZ, blah, 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 blah. Then you get into the negotiations, and it's like, okay, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, I know you caught me up to speed on everything. After looking at all this, using a line, what's the lowest price you would consider? And the tone inflection just changes depending on the situation.
Right. And I think they talk about the tonality inflection is always down. Mm-hmm. You don't want to make it sound like it's a question. You pose a question, but then you say it almost like an authority. So if we were to pay for blah, 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 and you run through your whole spiel, what would be the lowest price you would consider?
And just like that, you're not coming across like, what would the lowest price you would consider be? The differences there just convey a lot different.
The last one is the worst voice. A lot of people based off TV think this is like the only way you can negotiate. It's like the strict, you got to do it or what else, right? And it's called the assertive voice. Essentially, you are overbearing, you're loud, you're direct, you sound aggressive. It works for very few things. They talk in sections about, expressing anger. There's times where that can actually help you. Most of the time it hurts you. Yeah.
I know an example, at least Chris uses in the book, is a mistake he made when he used the assertive voice instead of the late night, FM DJ voice. And it created exactly that. He uses one of his real life examples. It created pushback from the person, the bad guy that they were negotiating with. Right. And you can see in the book, he was like, oh shit, this is a mistake. We've got to come in and fix this, because usually it breaks either any rapport that you've built up to that point, and the person on the other end is going to be like, oh, no, we're not going to, and just pushes them back. Exactly.
And so the three voices, everybody has like a default voice that they refer to, like that they just naturally talk in. Most people are the positive voice. Mm-hmm. So you can't control what your default voice is. You just need to be actively aware of how you're talking, because we all know that it's not always what you say, it's how you say it.
100%.
Let's go into the more important section. Now that we understand a little bit about tonal inflections, the book's biggest tip about talking to people is to listen. That seems to be the big takeaway.
And not just listening, but a term that they say is active listening. So we can take the two of us, for example. We're actively listening to what each other are saying and building upon it, or, mentioning or noting something that the other person said. You can listen, but not really be listening to.
Right.
And the other person is going to catch up on that if you're not really listening or paying attention to what they're saying.
And you don't want to think about what you're going to say next, because then you're going to miss the things that come through that aren't, the more subliminal subtext, right?
Yeah.
They talk about, what people say and then what they mean being different. You need to negotiate on what they mean, on that sub layer.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of the whole book.
And whether you're a seller in a distressed situation needing to sell a property, or it's a family member or a friend going through XYZ and, come to you for advice or help, just like the book says, and what we know is true, is on a baseline level, humans just want to be accepted and understood.
That's
so
huge.
That's the big part about active listening, is making the other person feel understood, feel appreciated. And so that's the biggest thing about active listening, is building that to make sure the other side feels that way.
So then it kind of covers, we're talking about this really in the context of like a book review, but keep in mind that these are all things that we actively implement.
Yeah.
The way to keep people talking and be able to listen better is a technique called calibrated questions. It's essentially the reporter questions of who, what, when, where, why, but you take out who because that's an easy answer. When, that's another easy answer. They give you a piece of information and then they're done. And then why, because why can be a very particular word. We'll talk about it. But really you ask what and how questions to get people to talk more. So instead of asking like, why are you selling right now? You might ask what's incentivizing you to sell right now, right? So you're asking questions that are open-ended, and then you just let that go. You ask the question, you shut up, and you just listen to what they say, and you just try to listen and hear for any information that they give you. Negotiation's all fact-finding.
And that does a couple things, right? One, it shows, it gives the other person, you should not be talking the majority of the time on these calls, right? One, it buys you time. It puts yourself in a position to be an active listener and listen to the other person. Two, it lets you, as a result, make the other person feel more understood. They're getting to tell you, the whole spiel A to Z about the property, right? Making them feel welcomed and understood. And exactly like you were saying, kind of the open-ended questions that do not have a direct answer, make it not so, cutthroat and, one-word answers from the other person or X, Y, Z, right?
Right. And so you're able to start doing a lot of fact-finding that way. Now, tell me this. When you ask that question and you listen, you don't want to be like an investigator, right? You don't want to be the guy that's sitting there drilling you with questions. So what happens, say you ask me a question, I feed you back an answer like it's in pretty good shape, but, it needs some work because the tenants did some damage. What do you do next?
The tenants did some damage?
So you repeat back the last few words, the most influential words, and that's called mirroring.
Which this whole book is filled with freaking great things from the first page to the last page. But mirroring, I think, especially is huge, especially in our industry when you're talking to sellers on the phone.
It feels unnatural when you start, but it's probably, once you use it, the most powerful tool that we use to continue to fact find when people don't want to talk, especially the aggressive, assertive guys who will shut you down. They respond very well to mirroring and asking, the last three words, the last one word. Yeah.
And the very first thing we have right here, which relates back to what we were just talking about, when you repeat something to what somebody just said, it shows that you're actively listening and that you're intrigued or interested in what they just said.
Right.
So like you were saying, tenants did some damage. The tenants did some damage.
You're asking because you want to know more.
Yeah.
And that you do inflect as a question. So in a situation where you're trying to fact find and you're talking to a seller, it's key that you start by asking them a calibrated question in your FMDJ voice or in your Playful voice, and then listen to what they have to say. And then when they say something that maybe is a little vague or you would like a little more knowledge on, when they finish whatever they're talking about, you repeat back just a little bit. Oh, tenants did some damage? Leave it at that. You don't have to explain why you want to know. And then the silence encourages the seller to talk again.
You got to shut up right after you do the mirroring. That's
key.
Huge.
And so when you shut up, they start talking to you, and now you continue to listen and you continue to find out more. Maybe they blew holes in the wall. Maybe there's a roof leak. Maybe they did some kind of damage to a window. Now you're finding out material facts that are going to help you in your negotiation.
So let's build on that, right? So let's use that example. So the tenants did some damage. They go in, they broke the window.
They broke the window, and, their kid drew crayon all over the wall. And honestly, I haven't done anything in the house in probably 10 years. So, I would expect that there's some work that needs to be done.
It sounds like this property has kind of been a little bit problematic for you.
I wouldn't say it's super problematic. They haven't asked me for too much. I knew that this was coming down the pike at some point when I had to sell. And I just don't want to have to put the money into the house.
Don't want to put the money into the house?
Yeah, I don't want to have to come up with the cash. I don't really have the money right now. And honestly, I'm retired. I don't want to have to, deal with the headaches. I'd rather just get out of the business.
So it seems like you just want to kind of cash out and use that money in retirement, huh?
See? And so Cade's already moving on to the next key thing. When you say something like, it seems like you want to, it looks like you want to, it sounds like you want to, what you're doing is you're labeling pain. Because sometimes sellers don't understand why they hate their situation so much, and you're guiding them to understand their situation. The backfall is that if you say, it seems like you hate being a landlord, he goes, I don't hate being a landlord. You didn't say you were. It just, when I was listening, this is what I think I heard.
Yeah.
And so you're providing that you're listening.
Yeah. And like you were saying, the big part is some of these, when you're talking to somebody, they may not even know what they're feeling and what they're thinking. When they have an outside person, not in an aggressive way, kind of in a guide, you're kind of like a guide. You're guiding the conversation. That some people might see it as manipulating the conversation, but really you're just kind of guiding the conversation. You're asking the questions and you're letting the other person talk, right?
Right.
That not only is reaffirming, it makes the other person feel accepted and understood, especially if you hit the nail on the head. It sounds like you kind of just want to cash out and use the money in retirement. The other guy goes, yeah. Or like,
yeah,
exactly.
That's right.
Exactly. It makes them feel understood and accepted.
So labeling is the process of helping them understand their feelings. So you have calibrated questions to fact find. You have mirroring to continue to fact find. Then you have calibrated or you have labeling to start kind of, touching on that subliminal emotional level, because humans are obviously emotional beings. And so now that you have some of these facts, you're starting to see, okay, I'm reading your body language, your tone of voice, I'm hearing what you're saying, but I'm understanding what you mean by it. Now I'm starting to understand your motivation. And if I can show you that I understand your motivation, that is an important step to being able to be the person that actually provides a solution. You want to work with somebody who understands you.
Yeah. And just like mirroring, after you place that label, again, it's important and can make or break the conversation for you to shut up and listen.
Yes.
Do your short thing, do your label, do your mirror, then shut up and listen. Let the other person talk.
That's going to be something that continually comes up. If you are somebody like myself, who I know that I come from a more assertive position, when somebody's quiet, I feel the need to fill the silence because I feel like you're giving me an opportunity to talk. Don't do that. You need to think to yourself, listen, shut up, ask a question. And I struggle with this constantly. It's probably one of my biggest issues in negotiation is I talk too much after asking a question.
Well, and I want to share an example. This was earlier this week or later last week. We were sitting in the office and you were calling up a lead to follow up with, a guy you had met out at his house to make an offer and everything. And I remember you asking, it was either a calibrated question. It was one of these things.
What is, what I hear you saying that you won't take my price. If I were to pay for everything, handle all the as-is sale, and make this as easy as possible for you, what would be the lowest price you'd even consider?
You shut up and listen. And I kid you not, everybody on here, it was at least 20 to 30 seconds of silence.
And
I
put my phone on mute.
You put it on mute and we were like, dude, this is perfect. And I kid you not, 20 or 30 seconds of just dead silence.
And then he said, I don't know. That's not the right answer. I don't know is probably worse. It is worse than yes or no.
Yeah.
And then I had to keep pushing to try to figure out what was going on that made him say, I don't know, instead of a price.
But still better than trying to, save yourself and scramble the conversation and try to say something possibly stupid in those 20 or 30 seconds, right?
Right. And he's somebody who I think too comes from more of, he needs to know all the details before he moves forward. So he's thinking. And I know that his personality type requires some silence to think. He can't hear himself if I'm talking. So that was important. So far we've built on four things: active listening, calibrated questions, mirroring, labeling.
Yep.
So the next most important thing is what makes this book somewhat controversial.
Yeah. And that's the no questions. Now, we use a variation of this almost, every time when at least when I call somebody and I, instead of saying, is now a good time, I ask, did I catch you at a bad time? Because people inherently feel more in a position of power when they say no as opposed to yes. So if I'm on the phone...
Think before we move forward on that,
Yeah.
just to give an example of why that's something that we've found, or an example of the book used to show the psyche part.
Mm-hmm.
Parents, when they get asked a question by their kids, will almost instinctively want to say no right at the start, and then they'll want to say yes after, right? So like, can I go out with my friends tonight? No. Well, I'm just going to be out until 5. This is what we're doing. But fine, yes, you can go. It's a position of power. Right?
Yeah.
Continue.
So if you're calling somebody who, a lead or somebody, hey, is now a good time? Instinctively, everyone's going to be like, is now a good time? No, it's not a good time. You caught me at work or blah, blah, blah.
Right, I'm always busy.
Yeah. So it makes people feel more powerful. And that comes back to kind of you guiding the conversation and knowing that inherently as the best way to have the best conversation.
The traditional negotiation school of thought is that you build up a reservoir of yeses and you get your momentum going through the yeses, that when you go and you say, are you ready to sign the contract? They'll say, yes. But the new thought process is that by getting them to say no to things, we're ruling out those options and we're narrowing down the path. So there's some things that you got to think about. One, people are scared of the word no in sales because it means no sale. But one of the good things that I learned from the book is tricking yourself to think when you hear no, think of it as these 5 things. I'm not ready yet. I'm uncomfortable. I don't understand. I can't afford it, or I need more time. So when I ask, are you thinking about selling right now? No. Well, that could mean I'm not ready yet. I'm not comfortable. I don't understand. I can't afford it, or I need more info. By doing that, I don't take that no as like, oh, I got to hang up the phone now. Now it's like, oh, okay. Well, when would you be interested in selling? Do you have a price in mind?
Open-ended questions.
And you start asking questions and listening. And then this is one of the really awesome techniques that I learned. I use this so often. It's mislabeling. When a conversation starts to get derailed, and they sometimes do, you have sellers that want to talk about anything but the deal. You can bring up a mislabeled thought. So say that they're motivated to sell, they can't keep the house, and they won't take your price. They say that your price is too low. Okay, it seems like you're not really interested in selling right now.
I love that one.
That will immediately get them to defend. No, I need to sell it. I'm going to sell it, and I will sell it for the right price. The right price? And now you're back into the conversation. The key is understanding that when you mislabel, you have to mislabel almost the opposite, because otherwise it looks like you weren't listening.
Yeah.
If you mislabel the exact opposite, you had to have been listening to understand what that was. And then when they come back, then you keep leading them back down the right path.
Yeah. And one quick note before we move on to the next little section in here is it's important to recognize when, when somebody says a counterfeit yes, or when it's not really a truthful yes. So
a deceitful yes.
In our example, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I was actually calling you about 1234 Main Street. I wanted to see if you had ever considered a cash offer. Is that something you would have considered or have considered?
Yes.
And someone goes, yeah, I've considered it. Just shoot me an offer. Call me back at this number. Hang up.
That's not a right yes.
That is the complete wrong yes, because you should be able to recognize that, okay, this guy or gal was,
not interested.
They knew it was a spam call. They get these calls all the freaking time, and, they're doing it to, what we have here is they say yes to escape the conversation, not be stuck in there giving you all the details and XYZ.
And so here's the other thing. When you're getting yeses in the traditional sales model, a lot of the time you get counterfeit yeses just so that they can get out of the situation. You're ready to sell. Yes. Are you ready to sign? Yes. Okay, let me go to my office and send you a contract. Bang. Well, all of a sudden they're not they're not signing, and they went and sold it to somebody else. Well, it's because they just told you yes, so that you would leave. What's important is the rule of threes as well. When you're working with somebody like that, you need to make sure that you continue to re-ask questions in different ways, because yes can be something that doesn't quite always work out. So keeping in mind, humans are instinctively really good at lying about yes. The more times that you can get them to say yes and lie about it, the more you'll catch it.
Yeah, 100%. So next, let's talk about a word. It's a word that
people misuse.
People misuse all the time. People use it all the time, and that word is the word fair. Now, what is so important, or what's the whole spiel with the word fair?
I'll summarize my understanding of it. I want your opinion too. My understanding is that inherently all humans' social construct wires their brain to want to be liked and part of the community. And fairness is something that they consider like of utmost importance. And if you insinuate that somebody is being unfair, it's one of the worst insults that you can do. But fair is also a word that could be extremely powerful if used correctly. What are your thoughts?
I agree 100%. And let's talk about those two polar opposites, right? One where it can be extremely damaging. If, for example, let's say we were on a phone call or in negotiations with a seller, and they want $50,000 more than the Zillow estimate.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, 9 times out of 10, a seller is going to start their price high, and it's down to the negotiation to get a good deal through all the other negotiation techniques. But if you're sitting there and right after they say they want $50,000 over the Zillow value, and you go, yeah, that kind of seems unfair. That's not really realistic.
Boom. You just lost all your rapport. There's nobody's going to want to talk to you.
Imagine being on the other end of the call, and you're like, who is a stranger, and what makes them think they can talk to me like that? Right. Boom. Lost.
Here's another example. This one's a little bit more subtle that you wouldn't normally think. If they say that they want $450, the estimate's $400, and you offer them $300, and their house is thrashed, it would be very, very sloppy negotiation tactics to say, well, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, with all the repairs needed, I believe that $300 is a fair offer. You're inherently telling them that they are not fair, and it completely breaks down anything that you've done.
And that's a great point. It makes you're painting out the other person and to be deceitful, or to be like they're absurd, or like that does the complete opposite of making them feel
like you guys are on the same page.
Exactly.
So let's talk about a good way to use fair.
Yeah.
One of the best ways that you could use fair is to start the conversation talking about reputation, because your reputation precedes you in all negotiations. If you want to be a big investor, you need to have a good reputation, or else sellers won't work with you. If you're known for beating people up and getting the best of people, you're not going to be worked with. You need to be known as the guy who comes up with fair deals and solves problems. So a great way to start would be something like, hey, Cade, before we talk about, the house and everything, I just want you to know that if I do or say anything that you feel is unfair, please let me know.
Absolutely. Will do.
What you just did is gave them the illusion that like they are now in more control, because who's going to call you out for being unfair by making a low offer? It's not unfair. It's just unpleasant. Now, all of a sudden, you're setting up the reputation that I want to be fair. And you do. You're trying to come up with a win-win solution. The win-win solution does mean each person has to give and take.
Absolutely. And another good use would be kind of posing the question, either the example I'm thinking of is, maybe you're going through the spiel like, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, typically when I work, with sellers like yourself. I pay all cash. I pay for all of the closing costs. I'm buying it in as-is condition, so you're not having to put any money into fixing up the house, and you're not having to pay any realtor commissions or title and escrow fees. Does that sound fair? And that you're listing all of the good things that come with your offer. And I mean, if I'm somebody and someone just said, explaining the terms, all cash, I'm not having to pay any closing costs, I'm not paying any money to fix other property, is it fair? Who's going to say no, that's unfair?
Yeah.
No, that's unfair. I want to pay for closing costs. I want to pay to fix up my property. So that's another non-detrimental or a good use of the word fair that you can use.
So let's talk about some things that you could use in place of the word fair.
Yeah.
So we use a lot of the time terms win-win. Mm-hmm. So if a seller's asking for us to pay $450 and our number's really $300, we'll say, hey, look, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, at $450, or you'd say, look, we like to make win-win situations. And at $450, that would be a huge win for you, and it would not be a win for me at all. And I feel like at $200, it would be a huge win for me, but it wouldn't be fair to you. So what would be a number in between $450 and $300 that you feel would be a win-win scenario where each person's walking away with a good situation? Or you could use the word reasonable. Reasonable sounds a lot like fair, and it has to be used with caution. But if somebody says, hey, I'll give you, or I'll sell my house for $380. It's very generous of you. And if the home was in tip-top shape, I feel that's quite reasonable. With the repairs that I know I need to make and the situation at hand, I would only be able to offer you $310.
For all of you out there who are struggling in negotiations when somebody throws out a price, that is the freaking textbook great way to handle that objection with sellers. So write that down, listen to that again, because that's a great way to navigate that price conversation with sellers without making them feel offended or without making them breaking down the rapport or anything that.
When your prices are that far apart, you can't view your counterpart as the enemy. Mm-hmm. They're not the problem. The unresolved price difference is the problem, and you two are teammates to find that price. It's a huge change in mindset. I used to feel like I would be angry with the seller. Like, you're not being reasonable. You're not being fair. I could feel myself getting emotionally involved. When all of a sudden I said, wait, this person is working in their best interest. It makes total sense why they want the most price possible. Now, we're just trying to come to a conclusion on where in the middle does this make sense, right? The book says never split the difference, and I just said where in the middle. I'm not saying that you actually have to meet in the middle. Mm-hmm. I'm just coming to a middle of understanding, and once you both have the same understanding of the situation, a price can be found.
So this is a good segue into our next section we're talking about, which is bargaining, which is a huge part of negotiations, price negotiations, whether it's in the real estate industry or not. I mean, we bargain with other people all the time.
For cars, for houses, for anything that you buy.
Yeah, with friends or family for literally...
Where you're going to dinner.
Where are we going?
Anything.
Literally. So, and that's an important note. I know we've said this before. This book is not only applicable to real estate or to sales or something. This should be a book that everybody reads regardless, because every day is a negotiation, whatever you're coming across, right? So, side note right there. So let's talk about bargaining. We were just talking about this yesterday when we were
training
Colin, which is in standard negotiating. The first thing we have here is we want to anchor. We want an anchor point. We want to anchor ourselves, anchor our conversation, anchor the seller to what?
An emotional price. Let's talk about what the traditional school of thought was.
Okay.
The traditional school of thought is tit for tat. You start at 50, I start at 100, we split the difference at 75. If you do it like that every time, neither person gets a deal ever. The great example would be, and this just shows non-monetary negotiation, but you have a husband and wife. Husband wants to wear brown shoes, and the wife wants him to wear black shoes with his outfit. and they can't decide which one looks better. So they meet in the middle. He wears one brown shoe, one black shoe. It's worse than either of our other two options. No deal is better than a bad deal.
Yeah.
So to not have a bad deal, to not always just split the middle, all of a sudden your flips are never making profit, you're overpaying, market shifts, whatever it is, and you're out of business. You need to understand these concepts. So, emotional anchoring. Do you want to explain what that is, Cade? It's the first step of bargaining.
So, anchoring someone's emotions, and let me know if you want to add or change any of this. Anchoring somebody's emotions is if you've got a seller who is kind of all over the place or in distress or their emotions are all over the place, any conversation that you have will most likely be irrational, right? If the person, just think of it, in the heat of an argument, if my emotions are flooding high and your emotions are flooding high, the conversation is not going to be productive.
Logical.
It's not going to come out to any logical conclusion. There's not going to be a good outcome, right? So being able to have either through, the labeling or the calibrated questions, anchoring the person down to a level playing field to where you can have a reasonable and logical explanation, even when the other person's emotions can be running high.
Yeah.
Because of whatever problems with the property or in non-real estate, whatever the other problem is.
So the standard here is understanding that you need to keep a level head, and your goal is to keep the other person level-headed too. That's how you get execution on top of good negotiation. The first thing in bargaining, and the difference between bargaining and negotiating is the entire process. Bargaining is getting down to the brass tacks.
Mm-hmm.
Let the other guy go first. Half the time that you're doing this stuff, you shoot yourself in the foot when you lead with the first number as the buyer. You don't know what they're expecting, and you don't know if you're going to over offer at the start. A great example would be if you went to a house and the seller made you say the first number and you offered him 150 and he was willing to let go of the house for 120. Well, you just gave up 30,000 and you walk away with, I think it's called winner's pocket. Instead of buyer's remorse, you have winner's pocket and winner's purse. And you wish you had made more. All of a sudden, your deal doesn't feel good because the guy accepted your first offer. You did something wrong.
Yeah.
So you always try to get them to give you the first price. In order to be a good negotiator, you need to be comfortable if you ask them for the first price and they say 250 to not have your emotions spike out of the blue.
Yeah.
We talk about first price anchoring as a punch in the face. You need to be able to take a punch and keep your cool, right? He's going to punch you in the face with the highest offer he wants. Well, he just set his limit.
If you take that, if every person you talk to, you weren't able to take that punch in the face from the first price, you would never close any deals.
No.
Because if your emotions are running high and saying, oh, that's way too much, there's no way.
That's not fair.
That's not fair. There's no way the seller and I are going to be able to come to terms. He's just way too high. I'm going to go on to the next call.
Nope.
Lost it. You will never close a deal that way. And real quick, to go back to, asking, letting them give a number first. It's why in our scripts and why now it's our secondhand nature when we're having a conversation, for example, hey, Mr. Seller, it sounds like you were telling me the home needs a lot of repairs. And like I told you, I'd be purchasing the home all cash. I'd be paying all the closing costs and title and escrow fees. I'd be purchasing it as is. You're not paying any realtor commissions. With all of that being said, what's the lowest price you would consider? That's why we always, always, always try to get them to say it first. Now,
by the way, we don't even give we don't give a price or a range until we've asked that like 7 times.
Yes.
Because we have our first person ask that 3 times. Mm-hmm. Our second person asks it 3 times. We ask it 3 times. Like like I said at the start, the rule of 3s, it's hard for them to push back 3 times. It's human nature. You start to wear down.
And like we were talking about, there's different ways or ways to build up to asking to that question. Now, if the first time you ask and they say, well, you know what, really just shoot me an offer. The example I'm thinking of is in our follow-up call when we're doing some comps, or sometimes the lead will ask for time for them to do a little research because they don't know what the property is about, is when you hop on the phone and you start talking about comps. Well, hey, Mr. Seller, I did a little homework and I saw that investors in the area are paying between $100 and $120,000 for properties in similar condition to yours, and blah blah blah. You kind of plant that seed, right? And then you ask the question again. With all that being said, Mr. Seller, I know we talked about the neighborhood and we've talked about the condition of the property a lot. What would be the lowest price you'd actually consider, and stuff like that?
Before we move on, you already used the next thing that's important here. So first off, you labeled, you mirrored. You did everything. You used calibrated questions to get here. They won't give you a price, or even if they do give you a price, they're setting their price point, or they're not giving you anywhere to start. Our first number that we give is a range, and you give a range and you place it on other people. So you do your research, you figure out what other investors have been paying for houses, and then you say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I appreciate you want $250. I did a little research myself, and that seems to be about what fair market houses are going for when they're fixed up. What that means is that investors in the area, I noticed, are paying somewhere in the ballpark of about $100 and $110. Is that even a price range you would consider? And so you've given them your punch in the face back, right? The key here is that if you are a good negotiator, you can take your punch without getting emotionally aroused, and you also can deliver that punch in a way that is not aggressive or hurtful. You maintain the rapport. You've built empathy with these people. You've become an understanding one of them, right? You're on the inside of what they're thinking. Hey, look, you know what? I did a little research, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, and it looks like other investors in the area are paying in the ballpark of $100 to $110,000. Is that even a range you'd consider? Now, a lot of the times, a seller, after getting hit in the face with that, who's not going to negotiate or who doesn't like to negotiate, will drop to their lowest number right there.
Yeah. And you made a really important point, which everybody out there, that a great reminder for when you're talking with sellers is you're making somebody else the bad guy. Let's take that phrase again. I did my homework and I see that other investors in the area are paying between $100 and $110,000. Is that even a range you would consider? Now take that and compare it to, Mr. Seller, I did my research and I'd be able to pay you between $110,000 and $120,000. When you put the burden on somebody else and you say, it looks like other investors in the area have been buying some houses in your neighborhood, or, are paying between 100 and 110 in the neighborhood. Is that something you'd even consider? You're taking yourself out of the equation. You're like, hey, look, this is what other
guys
people
will pay you.
And sometimes, and which is a good tool, I think I've heard you use this recently. That comes to mind is, after saying that, and they're like no, or even before they say whatever their response is, now. I don't expect you to take 110 to 120,000. That's not what I'm saying. I know your property's in a little bit better shape or XYZ, right? But establishing that
you can continue to walk that statement off without being aggressive. You've now anchored them regardless of whether they accept that or not.
Yeah.
Because now they know, well, shit, like I can't go, just blow this out at 250 and expect to get that. I'm really going to be in the ones. Because now, if they really wanted 250 and they hear 110 to 100, they're going to say, well, I would be a dog if I got 170, right? I'd be crushing the other guys. And that's what people really want to feel. They want to feel like they did well. That's something we should talk about, but that's important. Because even if they sell for a lower price, a lot of these people didn't have a reason for the specific price. It's an emotional price. If you come with something like a range, they're going to drop. Then, once you give that range and they say, No, I wouldn't even consider 100 to 110. My absolute lowest I will take is 160. Well, you just got him down $90,000 in one question.
Mm-hmm.
Great, Mr. Seller. Well, 160 is much closer to what I would be able to pay than 250. Now, if I were to buy the home, make sure that everything was done easily, I pay for all the closing costs, commissions, anything of that sort. You don't even have to go back to the house after this conversation. Realistically, what would be the lowest price you would consider? I didn't give a number back. I labeled a non-monetary term, which is the ease of sale. That's what an investor is providing. And then I asked him for another question or for another price. He's negotiating against himself. Now, well, I just came down to 160. I'm not going to come down to 110. Look, if you guys make this easy, I don't have to do anything else. I would take 145. That's it. Okay, you just went down $105,000. Now it's up to you to decide, can I make that price?
Now, let's build off that. So they say 145. You end the conversation with the seller with, okay, that's very generous of you, Mr. Seller. 145 sounds like it's definitely closer to something I can work with. Let me give my contractors a call. Let me see if I can budge them on their quote a little bit.
Sharpen my pencil is a term we say a lot.
I love sharpen my pencil. And, let me give you a call back later today or tomorrow or whenever it is, right? Boom. The next thing that the book talks about, which I know I've used on several of my contracts to get signed.
All of my sales are this.
Are with this, is when you come back to them, is using an odd number, a non-rounded number. So, for example, we're using the 145. You call back Mr. Seller and say, hey, Mr. Seller, hope your day is going well. I sharpened my pencil a little bit. I roughed up my contractors, beat them down on their quote. And the absolute best I can do is $139,735.13.
Wow. Okay. It sounds like you have a really specific number.
Yeah. As we know, the materials and everything right now, everything's going out the roof. But my contractors, I went back to them, I roughed them up a little bit. And, Mr. Seller, in talking with you, I really want to put this deal together.
How can we make that work?
How can we make that work?
I could see you're already going down the route of talking too much. Right? So whenever just a reminder, Cade and I are not we're not proof. We are not flawless.
Yeah.
I don't mean to point it out, but you notice how even just now you were talking. I think if you came to him and said, Mr. Seller, thank you for coming down. That's very generous of you to offer 145. I was able to come up on my price. I know we started and talked about that 100 to 110 range.
Mm-hmm.
The best offer I could make you is 139, 738 and 13 cents. How can we make that work? I don't even know if you have to really explain it. After you say that I've sharpened my pencil, maybe before you say I sharpened my pencil, I beat down the contractor a little bit, and I was able to get my numbers up. I don't know if you even want to say anymore.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Because now we ask a calibrated question. How can we do that?
How can we make that work? How can we put a deal together? How can we get this done?
And then, bang. So, now we're talking about $5,000, right? Either way, $5,000 doesn't make or break a deal for either person.
Yeah.
At the worst case scenario, you've made a statement that this is your highest price. If you do come up, you need to say, look, I'm willing to cut out of my profit to make this deal work. If I can do that, what would be the best way for me to send you the contract for signature? Guaranteed execution.
Yeah. Now,
rarely.
I'm trying to find out, because we've been jumping up and down here in this bargaining section a little bit. Let's talk about the Ackermann model real quick. Now, the book goes into this model called the Ackermann Model. We were just talking about this yesterday, in that we typically don't really use it.
I've never used it. It requires pre-calculation.
But we still wanted to talk about it just so people understand it. Just because depending on the industry, or depending on how you apply it, we know that there's been success doing it. We just have not used it.
We use a style of it. We use the subliminal like idea, but we don't use the numbers. So the first step in the Ackermann model, it's a bargaining model for just tit for tat.
Mm-hmm.
And you start by picking a price that's your 100% price. This is the price you want to buy the house for.
We're
going to use round
price.
numbers.
Yeah.
100,000.
Okay. Now, the number you want to start at, obviously negotiating, right? And never splitting the difference, meeting in the middle. Very rarely is your very first number you're going to throw out the offer the seller is going to accept, right? Now, I've had cases where that's true, but 99% of the time, the number you throw out, the seller is not going to want it. They're going to want to negotiate and get the highest price they can for their home. So if your max allowable offer is 100,000, there is no way you can go above 100,000. You're not going to start at 100,000. Under the Ackermann model, you're going to start at 65% of that price. So you're going to start your negotiating with the seller at 65,000.
So you start by asking them for a price.
Of course.
And they say, I'll sell it to you for 145. That's their anchor.
Yeah.
Now you're going to anchor them with 65.
Mm-hmm.
Now what?
Now, 65, if someone's at 140 and you're coming to them at 65.
Less than half.
Some people aren't even going to think you're going to be able to put a deal together that way, right? If you're that far off at 140. Now, you go through the whole spiel that we've gone through this whole episode, right? Which is labeling, mirroring, asking the open-ended calibrated questions, the non-monetary terms of the deal. And seller comes down and he's now at 115. Now, the Ackermann model says you started at 65% of your target price, which is 100. Obviously, the deal wasn't being able to get done. So now make an incremental jump to 85% of your MAO.
It's a 20% jump.
Mm-hmm. So we're going from
65 to 85.
Yep.
So your gap is now 85 to 115. So 30,000.
Yep.
A lot different. He might now say, nope, I'm at 115. Bad practice. If you can't get him to change his price, you can say, look, the best I can do is 95% of your price. So now your first jump was 20%. Your next jump is 10%, half of that.
Mm-hmm.
So now I can do 95,000, not a penny more. Now they're going to say, fine. If you can do 110, I will do it. Your final jump, and again, this is not the right way of bargaining. This is if you get stuck in just haggling
back and forth with the seller. Absolutely.
You say, look, my best price, my absolute best price is 100,000, and I'll even buy you your favorite bottle of wine. By throwing in a non-monetary thing, or throwing in that you'll give him a ticket to Disneyland that you guys were talking about, or whatever, right? Maybe he's into golf.
I'll pay you for your round of golf.
You and I can go out and play a round of golf once we do the deal. A non-monetary thing. They feel like they've gotten you. They've squeezed you for every penny.
Mm-hmm.
They drop to 100 and you're done.
Boom.
So that's only if you get really stuck in haggling. I've never had to use the Ackermann model. A way that we use it is after we've run our numbers, we'll look and see what other investors are paying, and sometimes we'll anchor using the same thought process. So if our number is 125, we'll say, look, after doing our research, we've seen that the other investors in the area are paying in the ballpark of 110 to 115. Is that even something you'd consider? Then we know that our offer needs to be closer to 125. We're not starting 65% of our offer price, but we're so confident that we know what we're doing with negotiation and fact finding that we can get them to 125 and come up 10 grand or 15 grand, and they'll come down the rest.
My thought, at least, is the issue with using a set model like that is every person you're talking to, everybody is different. Everybody's got their own personalities, their stories, their situations. It's very, very hard in anything to use a set model or a set method and make it work with everybody. That's where the rapport building comes in, and you being able to understand the other person on the end of the phone or the other person in the conversation. And for example, let's say this Ackermann model, the bargaining and negotiating. I work with a seller. I've bought a couple of his properties here in town where he's no bullshit. We'll go to the property and he'll tell me his bare minimum number. And I know with him, there's absolutely zero negotiating. It's either that number or it's done. So I'm not going to go through and try and do 65, 85, or even try and haggle him a little bit.
But he also has a much more realistic price than most sellers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that comes down to, again, understanding the seller, the rapport, and the relationship you've built with the other person.
I wanted to touch on something, too, before we move off of this, because this is going to be a longer podcast. So I just want to make sure we cover it. When we talk about no-based questions, they're important for you to know how to say no without saying no. So we actively seek no questions from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get asked a question or you're given a price, you have to disagree without being disagreeable. So, Cade, one of the things that we can do that we've done in the past is we'll say, that's a very generous offer. I can't make that work. I can offer you 110 to 115. How can we make this work? You have to be able to not say the word no, because people respond to no the same way that you are currently responding to no before training how to listen for it. So you need to be able to say, that's very generous of you. I'm sorry, I just can't do that. Using words like very generous, that's very kind of you, I really appreciate that. And then the phrase, I'm sorry, or I apologize, and then I can't do that. You don't have to give an explanation. You just say, I can't do that.
And another variation of that we use is, hey, Mr. Seller, that's very generous of you. That offer was very generous of you. If I did agree to that, that would definitely be a win for you. You'd be getting over market value for the property. If I were you, I would be ecstatic, right? But, I always pride myself in being open and honest. And me as an investor, it would not be a win for me if I was able to pay that price. How can we proceed, or how, something like that, using the win-win again.
Under that you would consider if I paid for all this, blah, blah, blah.
Boom.
All right. We talked about the what and how questions. We talked about briefly why is a tricky one.
Uh-huh.
Why is particularly tricky because why is a defensive. It makes people defend themselves. If you come into me and you say, oh, I did this. I say, why did you do that? Even if I said, oh, why would you do that? Any inflection with why can come off as making you be defensive. So we always talk about you don't use why, you use what encouraged you to, what inspired you to, what made you. When you ask why questions, you need to get them to defend you. Why didn't you accept the other offer? Why would you work with somebody like me instead of sell it on the open market? Why wouldn't you hold on to the house? You need to get them to start explaining why they would work with you.
Mm-hmm.
Don't ask them questions like, why would you hold on to the house?
Yeah.
Well, because I'm going to make great rental and the market's going to go up. And why wouldn't you hold on to the house? Well, because honestly, I don't really want to be a renter or a landlord anymore. And I'd rather sell the house, make a little money, and be done.
Let's use that example you just said, which I'm trying to backtrack. You said if somebody doesn't want to sell their property because they want to keep making their rental income, or if a seller comes to you and says, tenant just moved out, I'm really not sure what I want to do with the property yet. I haven't started anything. I don't know if I'm going to put another tenant in there, or XYZ. Avoiding the why question, what would make you want to sell? What would make you put, the 10 or 15 grand in there to get another tenant? Oh, because I've been a landlord. I love the rental income when somebody was in there, or something like that.
You're fact finding. Either you're going to find out that they don't want to have the house, or you're going to find out they do and that the timing's not right, and you can move on to the next person who does want to sell. So that's the brief synopsis on why.
Yeah. Now,
more juicy stuff here.
Yeah.
The illusion of control.
With the illusions of control, we've talked about this a little bit in giving the other person you're talking about the illusion that they are in control and controlling the conversation, right? Now, think of it as if you were getting a call from a telemarketer or you were picking up a cold call, right? Typically, you're not going to be happy. You're going to be irritated. You're going to be XYZ. As an investor or as the person on the other end of the phone, through building rapport, we want the other person to feel like they are in control of the situation. Now, we've talked about various ways to do that, one of which is asking those open-ended, calibrated questions, right? Catch me up to speed on the property. You're guiding the conversation. You're really controlling the conversation. But by asking that open-ended, calibrated question, hey, Mr. Seller, catch me up to speed on the property. Now the seller's going to go into the whole life story of the property and why it is the way it is, why he's in the situation it is.
Right.
And if I'm the seller and I'm being able to explain and tell you everything about the property, I'm going to feel like I have the illusion that I'm in control of the conversation.
Yeah.
Right or wrong?
Right. So the key here is understanding that when people feel like they're part of the solution, they implement things better. When they feel like they're part of the conversation, they're more engaged. Your job is to engage people on the call, find information, solve problems. One of the best questions that you can ask is, how can we solve that? Or how can we make this work?
And let's use an example, which we talked about earlier, is let's say you're talking with a seller, right? And the property is tenant occupied. The tenants are not paying. Obviously, the seller is in a distressed position. They're having to make the mortgage payment. They're not getting any rent. People are living in their house for free. And like you said, it's not about you and the other person being on polar opposites. It's about you guys being on a team. Right. So phrasing it in a way, Mr. Seller, it sounds like that is really frustrating for you, label. How can we solve this problem with the unpaying tenants? By doing that, by labeling and doing that and asking how we can solve the problem, you not only bring the seller onto your team, but you make the other person, the other entity, the enemy or the counterpart, instead of it being head-to-head like this with you and the seller. Right?
And also, by allowing them to talk out loud and provide solutions, they might even come up with a better solution than what you would have provided. They know the situation. You understand real estate. Your job is to bring solutions, but maybe they say, oh, I know that the tenant's my sister and she just needs the place to go. Maybe we could put her up in my house for a few weeks and give her an opportunity. Just give her some cash. Well, great.
So we've got a couple things to wrap up here. We've already emphasized multiple times the importance of calibrated questions, making your counterpart feel like they're in control of the conversation. Let's talk about guaranteed execution, guaranteeing that, the best way to guarantee that the deal is going to get executed, you're going to get the deal done. So you've mentioned the rule of threes, right?
Yeah.
Which is, it's hard to fake a yes, or it's hard for a seller to kind of dodge something if you ask it 3 times.
Right. If you say, are you ready to sign? And they say yes, and it's a counterfeit yes. And then you say, great, I'm going to have to get this all set up. Is it best for me to bring this back over? Yes. The more that they say yes, and the more they agree to something, the more difficult it is for them to then go against their word.
Absolutely. So we've got the rule of threes. We've got another rule here that the book talks about that we wanted to mention, which is the 7, 38, 55% rule. A little bit of a mouthful, but let's kind of break down what each of those percentages are.
It's all known stuff.
Yeah.
It talks about 7% of what people are communicating is the words that they say. 33% is how they say it, tonal inflection, things of that sort. And then 55% is facial and body language, like the face that they make when you ask a question. It seems like there was some hesitation, things like that. When you see that, they scowled when you brought up the tenant or the neighbor, maybe there's something there. Well, you got to figure that out. What's your relationship like with the neighbor? Continuing that route.
This is why, especially, keep this in mind. A huge portion of your communication, at least in this industry, before meeting the seller, obviously in person, is going to be over the phone. So this body language and face is going to be out of the question, which makes your tone of voice that much more important on the phone. One, starting off with being friendly, playful, your kind of normal voice, right? But then being able to mirror how the other person talks, how the other person reacts, your tone of voice becomes that much more important over the phone. And, let's use an example off the phone. I mean, if we opened and closed every episode of the podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in to the Pursuit of Property podcast. We thank you for listening. So my tone is still the same.
Yeah.
Well, and look at my face, right? Like I'm talking like this. I'm making a blank stare at the camera. Hey guys, thanks for tuning into the Pursuit of Property podcast. Total different. Right. And like you said, that's known information, but it's a good reminder for people to understand that the words you say are very little, although important, very little in regards to everything else.
The last rule is interesting because it's called the Pinocchio Effect. And the idea is when Pinocchio lied, his nose got longer. Humans do the same thing. It's not your nose, it's how much you talk. So if you're talking to a seller and then you ask them a question that seems a little fishy. So you're not working with a realtor and they go through a huge long explanation.
Well, my sister, her best friend was an agent. I've talked to them a little bit, but
the more they talk, the more you should have red flags going up about maybe this isn't the truth.
Yeah.
Not to say that long explanations are always a lie, but there is a correlation.
Yeah.
And the more that they talk in the third person, they, we, them, that would be people who are talking about other people making decisions. Usually they're the decision maker. The more that they emphasize, me, that is going to be somebody who's overemphasizing their position, and maybe there's somebody behind them.
Absolutely.
Examples would be if you're talking to somebody, well, my wife needs to really make a lot of this. Well, yes, the wife needs to be involved, but that's a cop-out. That's not really why you want to not take my price.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Mr. Seller, sometimes when people say that, I understand that we need to make sure the wife's on board. I agree with that myself. Sometimes they say that because they don't feel comfortable with the price, or maybe there's something in terms, or they don't know something and they want to learn more. Is it any of those? So just keep in mind, if they push the information off of them, or if they go for a long period of time, sometimes they're being deceitful.
And the last thing that we've got on here, which is something we talked about, I think it was our episode that we published either last week. No, not last week. This a couple weeks ago now, was how to handle your first appointment.
Yes.
And we used kind of some of Pace Morby's episode of the Bigger Pockets podcast.
Yeah.
And it's something called black swans. You mentioned one of them as a way to draw it out, which was, what did your realtor say about the property?
Mm-hmm.
Many times, if you don't ask, open calibrated questions or, build that rapport with the seller, there's going to be critically important details to the deal that may not pop up until it's too late.
Yeah.
Like, for example, if there's a realtor involved or if there's an attorney involved and the attorney has to approve the price that you're doing, that changes the whole navigation and the whole guide of the conversation in the deal.
Or the tenants or their family.
Or the tenants or their family.
There's a lot of things. The reason why it's called black swan was because way back when, they used to only think there was only white swans. So they always lived with the expectation that the next swan they'd see would be white, until one day a black swan popped up and it changed how everybody thought about what they could expect next.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever you're in negotiations, you can have hypotheses about what the situation is. You can't have any prejudice or think any matter of fact. We find out all the time that things don't make sense. An example would be I was negotiating a deal for some land for a listing. And I kept asking, well, what's the neighbor going to pay? Because the neighbor and she had a relationship, and she kept saying she didn't want to sell to the neighbor. Neighbor was her brother, and the brother was taking advantage of her. She felt her brother was taking advantage of her. Black swan. Whenever you go into a negotiation, you need to think about the fact that there's 3 black swans at a minimum on the other side. That if you were to know, it would change the entire conversation. And sometimes, most of the time, the seller doesn't even know that it's critically important to know.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to ask calibrated questions to get that information out.
Yeah, that's a huge point. I think when sellers not even knowing that it's a relevant detail, but for you can be huge or can be, a make or break for the deal, right? Like if, a sibling is a licensed agent to the seller and they don't bring that up until you've spent 10 plus hours negotiating, going to see the property, you finally come to an agreement, and then the seller goes, I think my sister's, I just talked to her. I think she's actually going to list the property on the open market. If you would just ask the simple question, what did your realtor say about the property on the first conversation? It would have saved you all those 10 hours. Right.
Yep.
All right.
This has been a long podcast.
Yeah.
We really try to break down a lot of this. Negotiation's one of our favorite topics. We knew that we could talk forever on this.
Yeah.
At the end here, we've had to kind of speed it up a little, or else we'd have a 3-hour podcast.
I know. For all you guys out there, we showed the side of the book, but here is the cover. Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depends on It by Chris Voss.
We're going to actually be putting the link to this book on our descriptions.
Yep.
So if you're looking to buy it, Audible is a great way to listen to it, or on Amazon to listen or to read it. And we recommend that you review this every time you're going on an appointment, just to kind of freshen up and make sure that you're still tip-top shape. Treat yourself like anything else. Maintain, increase, educate, and go from there.
And what we're also going to do real quick to wrap up is we've done 2 book episodes so far, 2 really heavily influential books. What we're going to do is also compile a list. It's going to be in our Instagram bio link. It'll have all the books that we talk about, the links to the books, and also the relative or the respective podcast episode where we talk about it, just so you guys have it for reference, because we get asked all the time, what books do you recommend?
Yeah.
Boom. It'll have this all there.
Awesome, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Pursuit of Property podcast. Cade and I cannot thank you guys enough for listening for the 3rd year straight. We are really excited for our upcoming episodes, and we have some that we've already recorded that are going to be coming out with some pretty influential people on mindset and motivation. So stay tuned for that, and thank you guys so much.
Thanks, guys.